guys, we're here to talk about the Haitian Revolution. In the AP book, it calls it the Haitian Revolution with an N at the end, but some historians call it the Haitian Revolutions with an S at the end because there were several phases of revolutions that happened, but because the AP book calls it the Haitian Revolution, I'm just going to talk about it as if it's one revolution that happened in many steps. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you all about this colony from the beginning. In the beginning, when the French were first there, they called it Saint-Domingue. That's in French. In English, it would be more like Saint-Domingue. S-A-I-N-T-D-O-M-I-N-G-U-E. Saint-Domingue. And the French used it as a pirate base. And think about it. Let me show you. Screen share. Let me show you where Haiti is. So, or at this time, it was Saint-Domingue. Here we are. Here's the US had been formed by now. Here's South America. Let's zoom in. Important, South America. So let's zoom in to Saint-Domingue. Was this island here was Saint-Domingue, and there were pirates. They called them buccaneers. Buccaneers. So they would, and what pirates do is they rob ships. What do you guys think they were robbing? Hopefully you're thinking they were robbing ships full of silver. If you were thinking that, you are correct, because the Spanish had the colonies down here that Bolivia, remember Bolivia had the silver mines, and they would put it on ships and then head back over to Spain, and then Japan got it, and China, we talked about all that stuff already. And so they would rob those ships, and they settled here on this island. And then eventually the French government convinced those pirates to quit being pirates. I don't think you guys should be pirates anymore. You should quit being pirates, quit being buccaneers, settle down, stop that, stop it. So they settled down and they took all their riches because they were really rich, and they bought themselves plantations, mainly sugar plantations and coffee plantations. And these were, you know, Frenchmen. They had white skin like me. And you all know that at this time, we're talking about the 17th century. White people, rich white people, rich white Europeans did not like to work. Just like do like, you know, hard manual labor, just like very, very wealthy elite people don't like to do hard manual labor now. They pay other people to do their labor. Well, back then you didn't have to pay other people to do your labor. All you had to do was come over here to West Africa and buy a bunch of slaves. So that's what they did. They came over here to West Africa. They bought a bunch of slaves, brought them back to Saint-Domingue and to work their plantations for them. Now, I want to take one tiny little bitty break in my lecture, and I want to tell you that these islands are often referred to as the West Indies. And that's really weird. Why would they be called the West Indies? These are not anywhere near India. They're not anywhere near Indonesia. Why are they called the West Indies? Okay, so Christopher Columbus, way back in 1492. If I know you guys are not American, most of my students, but if you were, you would have been taught this silly little rhyme. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's how you remember 1492. Columbus himself was Italian, but he convinced the Spanish king and queen to send him around the world. You know this story. And he was convinced, he was completely convinced that he had found these islands over here, where we have Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines today. Those are the modern names. These islands are the Indies. He was convinced that he was in the Indies. And so they called these islands over here that we call today Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti. They were calling them the Indies because that's where they thought they were. That's why they call the people Indians. Well, when they figured out they were not in the Indies, they started calling these islands here the West Indies. So these are the West Indies. And let me get over there. These over here, this group of islands, these are the East Indies. So anytime you ever see reference to the East Indies, this is them. If you see reference to the West Indies, these are them. If I were to zoom in, there are a bunch more islands. Look at all these teeny tiny little islands. And if I were to zoom in again, you'd see even more islands. The whole collection of islands, they're all the West Indies. Okay, now I'm going back to, I'm going to stop sharing and just make myself look big again. Okay. All right. So now we've quit being pirates and the French have started being, what did I say? Planters. Plantation, people that own a plantation are called planters. There were 4 social classes. Those 4 classes were called Grand Blancs, the top. Grand Blancs, that means large whites. No, I'm sorry. I'm a school teacher. I'm recording a lesson. Okay, great. Sorry, guys. Grand Blancs, large, the big whites. Those were the rich French whites that owned the plantations. But they were mostly absentee. They owned the plantations, but they actually lived in France. and they left the running of things to people back home. Now, these people, the French, they often would, the Grand Blancs, they, I'm sorry, I don't have any way to write it down. Let me spell it for you. Grand, G-R-A-N-D. In English, it looks like grand. In French, it's Grand. Blanc, B-L-A-N-C, Blanc, Grand Blanc. They would have sex with their female slaves. In other words, they would rape them. They had sex with their female slaves, and then they would often set the children free. So a Grand Blanc would have sex with a female slave, and then if a child was produced from that union, they would set the child free, so it was not a slave. Those children, they were, of course, a mixed race. They were half black, half white. They made their own social class called the Free People of Color. And they were the ones that really held society together. In all of Saint-Domingue, there were 24,800 of them. 24,800 free people of color. They were the militia members. They ran the government. They managed the plantations. Some of them even owned their own plantations and owned their own slaves. These were people of color owning their own African slaves. Then, beneath them on the social class were Petty Blanc. That means little white people, little whites. Petit, P-E-T-I-T, Blanc, B-L-A-N-C, Petty Blancs. And they did jobs, other jobs, like jobs that were beneath the free people of color, but above slaves. So artisans, some kind of labor, I don't know, maybe teachers, something that a slave would not do, something slightly above the level of a slave, but something a free person of color thought they were too good for. That's what the Petit Blanc would do. And then below that were your slaves. So those are your four classes of people in Saint-Domingue. All right, so in 1791, we had the French Revolution that began. And I talked all about that yesterday. French Revolution and their Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. When that happened, all four social classes, all four of them were inspired by the French Revolution. The Grand Blancs thought the French Revolution was this amazing thing because they were going to get more freedoms. They felt oppressed by the French government because the French were giving them more taxes and making more laws. And the French were actually trying to give a little more freedoms to the slaves and not completely free them, but make life a little better for them. And the Grand Blancs were not okay with that. The free people of color were really inspired by the French Revolution, because even though they were of an upper class, they didn't have as many rights as the Grand Blancs, because they were still people of color, and they still had legal restrictions against them because they were people of color. And so they were inspired that maybe they would finally be seen as equals. The Petty Blanc, they saw inspiration because the Petty Blanc felt that they were the most oppressed people on the island. They were the most oppressed people in Saint-Domingue because they were white, and people of color had more money than them. How dare people of color have enough money to own slaves when hardworking white people can't have slaves? That's what they felt like. And they really, really felt that they were the most oppressed people in the colony. And then you had the slaves themselves, who felt, really inspired by the French Revolution, because there's a revolution going on. The oppressed are rising up, and there's the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen that says that all people have rights, all people. So everybody all four classes see this revolution as speaking to them. Okay, so in June of 1791, the first part of the revolution, some historians say the first revolution, but the AP class says this is the first part of a revolution. The Petty Blanc actually started the revolution. It was them. They started the revolution. They took over an entire city. They revolted against the Grand Blanc and the free people of color, saying that they demanded rights. They felt that they were oppressed, and they wanted to be seen as better than the free people of color. So that was the Petty Blanc. Then that didn't last very long until August. So that was June. In August of the same year, just a couple months later, the slaves revolted. They said, this ain't happening, Petty Blanc. And they revolted. There was a major slave rebellion. The slaves rose up. And I forgot to tell you at the beginning, I remember telling you that there were 24,800 free people of color. There were about 30 to 40,000 Petty Blanc. Guess how many slaves there were? There were at least 500,000 slaves. 500,000 slaves. They revolted. They rose up and fought against their oppressors. So they were led by an ex-slave named Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint is T-O-U-S-S-A-I-N-T. In English, it looks like Toussaint. T-O-U-S-S-A-I-N-T. Louverture. Louveture. All right. They were also the slave rebellion was supported by the Spanish. The Spanish helped them. Why is this? Because the Spanish government hated the French. Spain and France were enemies at the time. And so anything that would hurt the French, the Spanish were like, we're down with helping that. So when the slave rebellion began against the French, the Spanish said, hey, we'll help you out. So lots of help. Okay. Now, do you remember in the last lecture when I talked to you about Napoleon? And I mentioned that Napoleon had taken over the government of France. I don't know that I really did a very good job of explaining it. I mean, I said that it was a forceful takeover. It really was, I mean, it was by force. It was a coup. Napoleon took over the government of France via a coup. And so now Napoleon is in charge of France. And he's now conquering other lands and making this French empire. He has mostly kept with Enlightenment principles, you know, all men are equal and religious toleration and being an okay person, mostly kind of. I have lots of opinions about Napoleon, but we don't have time to get into that. So, but he makes this one exception. He says his Enlightenment principles don't apply to overseas colonies. I'm going to say that again. The Enlightenment principles don't apply to overseas colonies. So war is very expensive. France has been involved in there was the 7 Years' War, and then they've been involved in a revolution now for a decade. And now Napoleon is on this conquest to conquer Europe. It's so expensive. And he's decided that the way he's going to make money is to get money from the most valuable colony on Earth. The most valuable colony on Earth, where 40% of all the sugar in the world and 50 to 60% of all the coffee in the world is produced at the time, or had been until this big revolution, and that is Saint-Domingue. Napoleon is going to reinstate slavery. So Napoleon sends 40,000 soldiers to Saint-Domingue with the intention to reinstate slavery. Then there's a war. The ex-slaves versus Napoleon's 40,000 soldiers. This is where, some historians say this is yet another revolution. The AP class says this is the continuation of the same revolution. And so there's a big war. The French actually have better weapons. But the Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean has diseases that the French are not immune to. And the French soldiers get sick and they start dying like crazy, and they actually lose. So Napoleon calls back his soldiers. He had sent 40,000 and only 8,000 return. A lot of soldiers died, 32,000 dead. So yay, Saint-Domingue is now independent from France. They name a new leader and on January 1st, 1804, they name a new leader, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, D-E-S-S-A-L-I-N-E-S. Gonna spell that again. D-E-S-S-A-L-I-N-E-S. Jean-Jacques Dessalines is the new leader of Saint-Domingue. They also changed the name of Saint-Domingue. You know, that was the name of their imperialist colonizers called it. They changed the name back to the name that the original native peoples called it, which was Haiti. H-A-I-T-I, Haiti. And Jean-Jacques Dessalines makes this grand announcement. I have given the French cannibals blood for blood. I have avenged America. He's famous for saying that. So sadly, the Haitian Revolution made slavery worse in a lot of the colonies because Europe and the United States couldn't get their coffee and their sugar from mostly Europe. But so because Europe couldn't get their coffee and their sugar from Haiti, they and they still wanted it. Other colonies started importing more slaves. So that kind of sucked, but it inspired slaves in all kinds of colonies. Slave owners started complaining that their slaves were not listening to them as well and not working as hard, because this revolution in Haiti had been a real inspiration. Also, what else happened? Napoleon was so disheartened by his defeat in Haiti that he gave up on the Americas completely and ended up selling his French colonies that were in North America to the newly formed United States of America in this very, very famous purchase called the Louisiana Purchase. It's a very famous contract, very famous sale of land. And that was all done because Napoleon was so upset about the defeat in Haiti. He was just like, oh, I give up on the Americas. Just sell that land to the United States. Let them have it. So he sold the remaining French colonies that were right next to where the newly formed United States of America, that was along the East Coast. And then the French had the center, sold it. And Haiti really struggled. Haiti as a nation state struggled for a very long time. And some of those reasons are they did this amazing thing of completely flipping the power structure. The people that were on bottom were now on top. But we have to think for just a minute. The people that were on bottom were completely uneducated slaves. Completely uneducated slaves are suddenly now in government positions. And you don't necessarily always want a completely uneducated person running the government. So that is one reason that Haiti has struggled. Another reason is a large debt that was put on them by France. This is so awful what France did to them. So, you know, France was making lots and lots of money off Saint-Domingue, the colony, lots of money. It was the wealthiest, most valuable colony on earth. So when they claimed their independence, France said Haiti owed them money, lots of money. France said that the government of Haiti owed them money for like, well, we were making all this money off this island, and now, like, what are we supposed to do now? How are we supposed to get money? You have to pay us. And France made them continue paying for almost a century, 100 years. Haiti was paying France this debt. And they called it an independence debt. Let's see, it kept Haiti completely broke. So they were now led by ex-slaves. They were completely broke. And it really made their country suffer financially. But I have so much respect for Haiti. They were the second country, the second nation state to become free and independent in the Americas. They were the first modern nation to be led by Africans, and they rebelled against slavery. They completely rebelled against the notion that human beings can own other human beings, and they won. They freed themselves, and that deserves the ultimate respect. So if you ever hear anyone say anything bad about Haiti, you need to defend that place. The Haitians stood up and stood up for the oppressed. They freed themselves. They broke free of colonialism. They broke free of imperialism and defended themselves. I mean, sure, life, it's hard to come back from that. And I support them, and they will rise up one day. Okay. Now, in the book, if you look at page, oh no, never mind. I'm going to stop right there. That's already notes for the next lecture. Okay, sorry, I had to talk to someone in the middle of my lecture. I'm once again talking to you from my hotel lobby, and someone thought that I was the receptionist and wanted to ask me questions about the hotel. Okay, I gotta go. Bye, guys.